I want you to slow down with eating because the worst thing in the world is to be the after-lunch speaker. And I really don't want to suffer that fate. Now, when Gail asked me to come and talk to you today, she said, you know, I want it to be sort of high level and, you know, don't go down into the trenches. Stay up there high, excite them and give them a vision and be brilliant. And I thought, okay, you know, can we have another speaker? Can I punt? It's sort of the challenge to do. What I'm going to try and do is convey to you some basics about information and, more importantly, people. Because we're caught in a zeitgeist, if you like, a mood in the world that has everything reduced to the wonders of technology and massive amounts of data. And you're always pressurized to think that if you don't keep up, that somehow you're a laggard, you're falling behind, and the rest of the world is ahead of you, cleverer than you, faster than you, hipper than you, more in tune with technology than you. And of course, with big data being thrown at us everywhere as the answer to all known problems in the world, it's easy to feel slightly overwhelmed. Well, I want you to leave today feeling less overwhelmed and a little more, perhaps, in control of your own working practices and your choices with technology as you go forward. Now, do we have a lot of data? Yeah, we have gazillions amounts of data. I don't know how you're going to measure it, and the estimates that we get I always take with a pinch of salt, but here's a current estimate that we create 170 billion gigabytes of digital information a year. That's already out of date, okay, if we could even measure it. What does that mean? When I try and make that concrete for people, I say if we printed all that data out, we would form piles of paper. Not that we would do this, but if you could. You would form piles of paper that would create 12 stacks reaching from this planet to the sun in a year. That's 3 million times the amount of words in all the books ever written in civilization in a year. And then this beautiful quote from Eric Schmidt at Google, if we can believe it, from the dawn of civilization until 2003, our species produced 5 exabytes of data. Also, now we produce that amount in 2 days, okay? You can be slightly in awe of this type of estimate, or you can be slightly cynical. And the reality is to be somewhere in between. Something is happening. Something quite profound is happening in what I would call the ecology of information, the space within which you reside and information resides around you and impacts you. It is changing. We're at a moment of history that we haven't seen before. There has been no equivalent. So it's very, very exciting. But this is not the first time information has impacted us, okay? I'm going to give you a 25,000-year history of the world in 5 minutes. Since humans became cognitive, they've recorded their thoughts, and they've used externalizations of those thoughts in the form of pictures or images to share ideas. Okay? Go back to cave paintings. It's not art. It's beautiful, but it's not art. It's likely it was highly functional. This is what you might find here. This is where you would go to find this kind of thing. Okay? It's a signal to a community. We find early traces of writing 5,000 years ago. Okay? And it's likely that it existed before that. Humans making scratches, making marks to leave a record. The first library, we think, 2500 BC. The creation of the alphabet. Early Greek writings, and we're coming up, you know, we're still in the BC era. First bound books, 100 BC, okay? So there's a long, long trajectory in our history, a long timeline where we have been involved in creating, recording, externalizing our thoughts, and that's essentially information. Move it forward. You get woodblock printing well before Gutenberg. The Chinese had invented woodblock printing hundreds of years before that. Okay, but if you read a sort of a modern history of the web, you might be inclined to believe that all suddenly happened with Gutenberg, and now we're having the next Gutenberg revolution. In fact, like most inventions, the timeline for it is rather fuzzy. And the events that seem to be critical are often predated by any number of prep events. We're called preparatory events or creations or forms of technology or activities that gave rise to them. And they often are not terribly well studied or terribly well understood. Metal type 1455, we had a digital classification system 500 years ago. The first daily newspaper, we might soon be seeing the last daily newspaper. Okay, but the first in was 1650, okay? And actually there's an interesting argument that's come about by some people that will argue that the Gutenberg era that gave rise to the printing press and knowledge, books, periodicals, publications that we know is going to be a temporary blip in civilization, known as the Gutenberg parenthesis, that it's going to end soon and then we're going to revert back to a form of communication and information systems which are very, very different, but more like the pre-Gutenberg era. That's a rather frightening doomsday model, but some people are giving it some serious thought at the moment. First photo, nearly 200 years ago. Then the mechanical typewriter. Note what happens. We start to mechanize, start to automate, start to use and leverage technology to enable us to do the kinds of things that we were before doing in a very hand-oriented, crafty sort of fashion. First TV broadcast, 1930. You could go on and on. Each one of these deserves some serious consideration for what it enabled. The ballpoint pen. If you grew up under the tyranny of learning to write with a fountain pen, especially if you were left-handed, you know what that, the horror of trying to write neatly to a teacher's desired standard in that way. Ballpoint pen was quite an amazing invention. The first cell phone was 1947. The old joke is it was only this big, and the batteries couldn't fit in the room. But it's that kind of idea that we think of cell phone as something terribly new. It's not terribly new. The ideas for it, the idea of taking apart, detaching you from an infrastructure, making you mobile while you could talk, goes back, the ideas in the Second World War. Well, this was a tremendously important enabling technology. First browser, now soon 20-year anniversary. I mean, there are people, I always joke, who are on this campus who do not know a world without a browser, okay? And they are increasing. So before you know it, they are the majority. And then when that happens, we have hit what they call the tipping point. You are the dinosaur. You are the people who remember a world before that. So there is a change. There is something profound here. There is something here that we should study. It's not necessarily all the things we think of. And when I stopped at 2010 with the iPad, I mean, this will go on and on. The pace of change for the technologies that impact us will probably increase. Okay, so there's going to be a new technology all the time. But I want to argue for you that in some ways you get distracted by that. By watching the technological layer change, you tend to miss something fundamental that's happening with humans. And the only way you can study that is by studying people and the way they react to information and the way they use, exploit, and take advantage of information technology. It's a truism of our field that most technologies end up being used in ways that the designers never intended them to be used. Because humans are ingenious. We react. We make things work for us. We distort the intended purpose. And it ends up that the use people now are making of mobile phones is probably not at all like the use intended 10, 15, 20 years ago. But humans have just made those adjustments possible. And that pattern will always continue. So what would we conclude from this? And what I would conclude, what our school, in some grand sense of understanding it, tries to study, is what's happening to civilization now as technology and information technology in particular rolls out and accelerates at this rate. And to notice that the human in this sequence is key. So language gave rise to writing, writing gave rise to printing, we've got to the point of computing. Computing itself has interestingly moved in the last 20 years. I mean, it's very hard to put an exact timeline on it, but somewhere in the 80s, computing shifted more to processing language than processing numbers. When it first started, it was all about computation, particularly automating computation. And that's profound, it's important, it's efficient. But once we start morphing into language, and then from language into images, it's a very, very different use of a technology, and it presents very, very different challenges. So I would argue that we're at a moment of profound change in the ecology of information, and it's one that we'll only manage, not from studying the technology, but from studying the people. Okay. So you'll hear the expression big data a lot, and whatever it is, it's big. I'm not going to talk directly about big data in this talk. So if you came thinking, we're going to learn all about big data, you can't just learn all about big data, okay? It doesn't work like that. But what I'm going to try and convey to you is that that's not where your attention ultimately should be focused. Now here's a beautiful quote from what is in fact a beautiful book, The Human Face of Big Data. It's a very big book as well, if you've seen it. And it's full of sort of wonderful analyses and extractions from data of patterns in the human condition, of techniques that we now use to give insights that we weren't able to gain before. That is profound. The ability to extract meaning from large amounts of data is one of the great, great challenges of our time. And we're only at the start of it. But there's a quote in there from Michael Malone, who wrote a chapter in it called A Demograph of One, which sort of struck me, and I wanted to sort of pull it out for today's talk. The history of mankind has always been influenced by a shortage of knowledge. Now the opposite may soon define our lives. Okay? That sounds incredible. It sounds beautiful. I'm here to tell you it's wrong. Okay? It is completely and utterly wrong. We are not going to have an excess of knowledge. You can't have an excess of knowledge. Okay? You can have an excess of data, but you can't have an excess of knowledge. So when you read quotes like that, they're pithy, they're wonderful, you could put it on a t-shirt, and you could quote it to your mum and dad when you leave campus. But it's not meaningful, okay? So lesson number one, remember that. An air of cynicism. I love this picture. It doesn't come out too well here, but I want to make the point that new human behaviors, the ones we're supposedly focused on and mediated by technology, are really just like old human behaviors. Now, this is a picture taken a couple of years back now. If you look at the model of that phone, it's in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's beautiful about this is that the way cell phones are being rolled out and used in Africa is a lesson to all of us, because they are morphing the infrastructure around it in ways that we just don't think of. You know, it's a lot easier to make international phone calls from anywhere on the planet than America. Travel, and you'll understand. People just recognize ways of using, utilizing, exploiting that technology. The infrastructure surrounding that goes down to an ability to find a battery in the remotest part of the country because somebody's providing the infrastructure supply for that. It's become so important to these people. This chap wears it round his head because this is considered a jewel, a thing of beauty. It's a parade. Over here, it would be a nice car. There, it's a nice phone. Why? Because this is the way humans have always been. We like to show our possessions. We like to reveal something about ourselves through the objects we own. Do you hear that discussion talked about much when we talk about the cell phone revolution? Not really. The rest of the world is just manifesting the same behaviors humans have always manifested. The other key part of that, so don't think that all new behaviors are particularly unique that have never been seen before. We're humans. We tend to repeat ourselves. Okay? The other part of that is that there's a growing use of technology around the world, which is going to swamp the use in what we would have called the civilized or first world. 1/3 of the people on this planet only have access to the internet right now, roughly. That means 2/3 out there are waiting to get access to it. And they're going to get access to it. And when they get access to it, it's going to happen very, very quickly. English is not going to be the dominant language of these people. The infrastructure that we've created, the websites that we've created, the world of information that we think we know and we own and we've led and we've designed is about to be hit by a wave of people who don't necessarily share that understanding or even that desire to have it designed that way. So if you think we've lived through very interesting times in the emergence of an information infrastructure so far, stay tuned. It's going to become much more interesting in the years ahead. Okay? Remember, the vast majority of the world have yet to get online. Okay? I think that surprises most people. It should surprise you. We live in a world where we just assume automatic connectivity. We complain if there's a download lag. For a lot of the world, those issues haven't happened yet, but they're going to happen. Okay? So it's sort of come to this. These images already are out of date, but everybody's multitasking. And here's an interesting one: cars. We spent a long, long time. I did work on car information systems, the inside control devices on cars, and some early work on cell phone use in cars. And I can tell you, you shouldn't use a cell phone in a car. Okay? You kind of know that. You sort of know it, but you use it anyway, don't you? Because it's irresistible. When you get a call, you answer. When you talk, you deteriorate your own information processing. And we've got lots and lots of evidence that no matter what sort of tasks you give people, even fairly routine ones, there's a difference between someone in the car talking to you in person and a machine, a speaker in your ear. Even the hands-free phones, they're a distraction. Okay? That's not really the point. I love that cartoon. Birth rate suddenly spikes. Why? Because there was a Twitter outage last year. Now, what that's pointing to is the fact that if you walk around the place, if you walk across campus, when classes come out, what's the first thing you see? People pour out and they're in another world. Now, increasingly, they're with headphones on. This is this great, solipsistic, I'm on my own kind of world behavior. And there's this constant wiring and need for attention, or a need for attention giving because your attention is being grabbed by your technology. How many of you check email the first thing when you get up in the morning? Don't be shy. It's more than that. I know. How many of you get up in the night and you actually check your email? Who will admit to this? It's frightening, isn't it? I mean, that is sort of frightening. How many times will you check email before you go to bed tonight? Now, 10 years ago, were you doing that? Were you doing it 15 years ago? We seem to have got caught in a loop where our attention is grabbed all the time, and we have this need for it, and we don't want to slow that down. And it takes you away from other very important things. A piece of advice I give to my junior faculty when they come in, although I don't know whether they pay any attention to it or not, is that you should turn off your email for about an hour. No, turn it off and only open it for about an hour a day. So open it in the morning, check your email, respond, shut it down. Because when you're sitting at your office, you're invariably staring at a screen, you've invariably got your inbox open, and when a message comes in, even for a second, you look at it. All these micro distractions are taking you off task. It's a new phenomenon. You don't have to respond to email the minute it hits your inbox, but there's a compulsion in some of us that we have to. There's an implicit compulsion given by students, for example, who say, I sent you an email 5 minutes ago and you haven't answered. It's that sort of currency, the normality that's taking over the way we sort of behave and engage. And this notion that somehow, okay, we might actually stop reproducing because we're too busy looking at screens is not actually, one hopes there are some drives that overwhelm even information technology, but we're not certain what they are yet, okay? I like this graphic. It comes from one of the many sites that tell us how much data there is. Of course, remember what I told you, all the numbers are meaningless, okay? They're wrong, guaranteed wrong. But they're sort of interesting. What happens in any 60 seconds in the day in our wired planet? Well, YouTube will have 600 new videos put up. 168 million emails will be sent. You can get jaded with this stuff. Because when I look at it, I think, is that all? Surely it's more than that now. But maybe it is more than that. Maybe it's less than that. But the numbers are just sort of mind-boggling. 13,000 hours of music streaming on Pandora in any 1 minute. 13,000 iPhone apps downloaded. I mean, if you think about this in terms of where you've come in your own life, this stuff wasn't happening. It's coming up around us, and we're getting saturated with it. And we're believing that this is profoundly important. It's profoundly important in some ways, but not in others. And one is not to necessarily know this is happening so you can participate in it. It's knowing what it's happening so you can choose. And if there's a message I want to give you today, it's you have choices. And the big choice you should make is to learn the difference and engineer for yourself the difference between an information need and an information want. Because the industry is after you and make you want stuff. You should decide what you need and then pursue that and use tools and technology which help you filter everything else to get that. There's a real design challenge there. Okay, so we're part of this. You'll see these graphs everywhere. I'm not going to go into Moore's law. If you don't know what it is, look it up. But whatever it is, it's happening. It's getting faster. Every couple of years, things are doubling. Everything's going up. Everything up, up, up. Charts, tablets, computers, smartphones. We used to be the manufacturing. Now we're in the age of the customer in smart computing. We pass through personal computing. I mean, network computing is so old hat. Okay, are you feeling left behind? Or are you feeling totally current and on top of all that? It doesn't matter. These are just terms that get thrown out, and people put brackets around and say, I think 1990 to 2010, that was the age of information. We're post-age of information now. When are we going to be in the age of knowledge? I don't know when that's ever going to come, but someone will call, we've been in the age of manufacturing. Graphs like that go up all the time. I want to show you some graphs where things don't always go up. How smart are we really? I don't know if any of you is eating a carrot right now, but I was stunned by this. I got this data from Rob Lejeune at IBM. In the US, a typical carrot has traveled 1,600 miles from a field before it gets to your plate. How smart is that? Okay, it's kind of smart that we know it. It's kind of frightening that we know it. Someone can actually tag this. How many hours are wasted in a day in Austin by people looking for somewhere to park? Frightening amounts. We actually can estimate that quite now. I mean, there's data analysis, there's big data, but does that make you smarter? I think it makes me feel more, unhuman. It makes me worry about what I'm doing when I find these things out. Grocers and customers are throwing away nearly $50 billion worth of food every year. And yet we have starving people on the planet. How smart is that? Can we use the data and the analytics and the measures to actually change behaviors? Healthcare system, we hear an awful lot about it. $100 billion a year in fraud, and that's only an estimate. It's invariably a low estimate, okay? More than 2 million prescription dispensing errors made a year. In 60 seconds, how many prescriptions are handed out? How many prescriptions are written? Are you surprised that it's only 2 million a year that somehow we've got it wrong? We get it wrong for any number of reasons. Handwriting, reading, bad keying, getting lost, mixing names up. I mean, the fact that a system works at all should be a source of wonder to many of us, okay? If you walk away with one image today, walk away with that one, okay? Because it's not the data that matters, it's how you use it. That, as you now see, is a red image that popped up on the screen. I gave you a data point, okay? Slide came up with an image. That's a data point, okay? What is that? Tomato. It is a tomato. It's not a tomato. It's a tomato. You are correct, sir. You, sir, are correct. That's an information point, okay? So the fact that it's a tomato, you now have turned that data point to information, okay? A tomato is what? It's a fruit. Ooh, clever. You see? You don't get that from the image, but you know a tomato is a fruit. We've now taken that piece of information and we've made it knowledge. I'm going to help you turn that into wisdom when I tell you that that's a fruit that you don't put in a fruit salad. Okay? It is funny in a sense, but it's very real. That image can be abstracted at 4 different levels, okay? And we have become obsessed and concerned with one of the lowest levels, data. The fact that there's millions of those images floating around and more being added by the day is interesting up to a point. But it's what you can do with that data, how you interpret it, how you frame it, how you apply it knowledgeably, and ultimately refine your knowledge to wisdom, which is really where we need to be studying and where we need to be going. So in the big data world, it's fantastic. I want the big information, the big knowledge, and the big wisdom world if ever we can get it. Is it a real tomato? The answer is no. It's a representation of a real tomato. Absolutely. Well, that's we could spend the next 30 minutes going back and forth on that. And then you had the next stage after wisdom is just annoyance, and that's where the crowd will end up there. But I'd be happy to go back and forth with you on that one. So Austin, we have a problem. Now, there are any number of studies that look at people sitting down and using computers. I know because I spent a large part of my life doing that. And I have faculty who spend a large part of their life doing that. And what are they looking at? Well, we're watching what people do when they use an app, when they use a screen, when they sit down in front of a computer. And this field of what we call human-computer interaction has been around about 30 years. And it's yielded some pretty interesting data points about what people are doing. But I think this is one of the more interesting ones. It's a small study. It was 150, 160 hours worth of observations of people just using a computer and logging what they're doing. By the estimates of the analysts here, about half the time they were productive. The other half of the time they were switching apps, they were getting lost, they were looking for something they'd already found but had misplaced it somehow. They were fighting with the system because something had gone wrong. Okay? Now we think by most reasonable estimates, you're spending about 40% of your time online or with computer systems or with your mobile devices doing things which are not really key to your productivity. Now, that can be anything from I'm distracted and I'm just browsing, I'm off task. It's just, you would be amazed at the estimates of how much time across the working organizations of this country productivity is lost to people just doing stuff like that. It's staggering. But just even recovering or doing the routine thing, putting in the passcode again, taking it out of your pocket, getting the physical engagement with the piece of information, the data you want in front of you, there's just this constant recycling of efforts which are non-productive. Okay? And we're doing more and more of that, and we're trying to figure out how we can design around that. It's not easy. I mean, not only are we living in an attention economy, we're actually living in a surveillance economy, so you actually have to protect yourself when you're doing lots of this online, because other people are trying to grab your attention and find out where your attention is being grabbed by, so they can use that for their own ends as well. This is not what we're particularly interested in designing for. We'd like to design against it, but we have a battle. We have a battle on the technological front looming with the philosophy and the drive that we think should be behind our information infrastructure. And I would, in one sense, warn you that it's actually a very difficult battle to fight. But I think we have to fight it, because otherwise we're going to create an information environment, and that's a whole other talk, where you will have less and less control, and less influence and choice, and more things made for you. This guy, if you don't know him, is what CNN called the guru of usability. Those of us who know him call him something else, but that's a whole other conversation. He says, yeah, there's been many advances in web technology, and we could delete web and just say information technology generally, but they typically haven't addressed the real issues that cause users to get lost, to misinterpret sites, or to be annoyed. And that's absolutely true. We've made great progress in the speed, in the size, and in the cost of the devices and the infrastructure. What we haven't made progress in is really understanding how do we make it better for people. And that's what our school is entirely committed to understanding. Now, I'm going to tell you today that the bottleneck here is, several bottlenecks. The major one is you. It's your brain. And I'm going to introduce you to some parts of your brain that you might have forgotten you had. And there won't be a quiz, although I might ask you to do a few things along the way. But I want you to get a sense that there are some limiting factors on the speed of evolution of technology that have nothing to do with the infrastructure or the technology. They have everything to do with you. The way you're made, the way you're wired, the speed you are able to process information. That is not going to change. Now, no matter how fervent a believer you are in evolution, it's not fast enough to change our cognitive architecture in a lifetime. Okay? So we're always going to have short-term memory issues. We're always going to have memory loss. We're always going to have limits on our reaction speed. They're not going to change. These are, if you want constants in the world, they are the constants. And I refer to this as the acceleration of inequality. Everything is getting faster in the tech realm except you. Everything. And I think it doesn't matter if it's following Moore's law or Moore's plus law or the next law after that. Even if it levels off, it doesn't go up as fast. You're not changing. Okay? So that inequality is just going to get sort of faster. And it's the wrong sort of question to ask, how do I make myself faster? Or why can't I keep up? You can't. You're hardwired to certain limits. You should enjoy them, recognize them. The only trouble is I lied about you. You're not actually flat. You're going down. It's sort of tragic, but it's the reality of life that as you get older, your processing speed slows a little bit. Your perceptual speed slows a bit. You know, if you've been a video gamer a long enough time, there comes a moment of realization in your 30s that most teenagers can just whip you because they are just faster. And no matter how much you practice, yeah, you can compensate, but there are limits here. Now, the beauty is, of course, we say that, you know, your memory, your long-term memory, your short-term memory might start getting smaller. Your long-term memory just is infinite. You can get stuff in there. And I say that's absolutely true. I'll tell you as a psychologist, there's no limit to what you can get into your head. Your only problem is your retrieval ability will go down. So it's definitely in your head somewhere. You just can't remember it anymore. And that is just, you know, you want a law of life, you want a law of technology, that's a law of life. Okay? Deal with it. Okay? We can try and design around it. We actually are trying to develop technologies to augment that predictable loss. Now, we're sort of joking about, okay, we're all getting a bit older, and this is going to happen to us. But the reality is, if you look across the United States in particular, you're going to see a massive growth in an elderly population. Now, curiously, this is going to be an elderly population that has grown up with technology. And so by 2040, 2050, we are hoping there will be technologies around that will not necessarily reverse that, but find ways of compensating for it in design, because that audience of people are not going to accept the fact that technology is not designed for them. They're going to demand it and expect it. And that's going to be a major force in the shaping of information technologies in the years ahead. Okay, it's easier for those front, but try it on the side as well. I want you to learn something about your own perceptual system. Stare at that black dot. Now, as you do, you might experience perspective shift. You getting that? Okay. This was developed by Professor Necker. This was his great contribution in life. He drew these lines and put a dot on it, but forevermore is known as the Necker cube. Now, if you're looking at it straight on, you might notice a perspective where this panel becomes the front, or the other panel becomes the front. And then if I say to you, try and control it and hold it, where one part of it is always the front, and don't let the shift occur. Can you do that? And most of you can't do it. And in fact, the reality is if you're all front line on it, those of you at an angle are not going to get as head on. You're welcome to come down after the talk and try it on a large screen. You can't control it. It's an automatic process. Automatic processes that are wired into you. Okay, so there's this trick of depth. Now that's a very, very rudimentary drawing. That's just a collection of lines I scribbled in PowerPoint. But I can already predict how you're going to see it. Okay? Are those lines parallel? Oh, come on, don't be shy, I'm not tricking you. They're parallel, okay? Thank you. Are they? Yeah, they are. They're still parallel. Do they look parallel to you? They don't look parallel. Are they really parallel? Okay, so things aren't what they seem, maybe. So I love this one. You can just go back and forth, and you go, what? I've had students, doing this in the class and coming over with rulers and sort of they can't quite believe it's sort of happening, okay? How about that one? Are those two lines, those two horizontal lines the same length? Of course they are. It's the Muller-Lyer illusions, guaranteed. What if I told you I cheated? Actually, the smaller one is smaller. Would you believe me? You shouldn't. No. Yeah, exactly. All right, there is no comeback to that. Okay, they are actually the same lines. And if you go online and just do a search on the Muller-Lyer illusion, there's these beautiful illusions which allow you to hit a button and move this line up to there where it overlays it. And I've seen people do that. And they go, no way, it's the same length. But because it's bounded by the shapes on either side, that teaches your brain to think of constraint or expansion, and you imagine there's a different effect there. Why would I show you these things? Oh, I love this one. I'm going to try the first ever collective experiment. It's usually done individually, collective. Okay, on the count of 3, I want you at a slow, rhythmic pace to read those words down the screen. Okay, you got that? So I'm going to ask you just to read them out loud. Don't be shy. On the count of 3, to a rhythm. 1, 2, 3, red. Can you do it a bit faster? 1, 2, 3.
Red, green, blue, orange, yellow.
Okay, now I want you to tell me what's the color of those words on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Blue, purple, yellow, green, red.
And even though you know it's coming, even though humans can try and practice this one, I can guarantee you I can set the conditions up where they'll still mess up or slow down. Why? Because you have two competing vectors at work in your brain. One, you've automated language, okay? So you see the word red, I can read it. You don't even have to think, oh, what's that word, G-R-E? You're past that. It's automatic processing for you now, okay? Red, green, blue, orange, yellow. But at the same time here, when I say, okay, what's the color? The answer is it's blue, okay? But you're finding it very hard to suppress the answer red. Okay, so your linguistic channel and your visual naming channel, there's just the modalities are competing with. This is known as the Stroop Effect. It's a classic old problem that psychologists sort of devised for the sheer fun of exposing the lunacy of people years ago. But what actually tells us something quite profound, that a lot of the time when you're sensing information and you're receiving data from the world, you're not concentrating and rationally thinking about it and processing it. You can't work that slowly. You have to develop automatic processes to deal with the world. And that once you've developed them, it's very, very hard to fight them. It's a bit like when you're learning to drive a stick-shift car. As a good example, if you've never driven a stick-shift car, this probably won't mean a lot to you. But if you've driven a stick-shift car, when you started to learn it, it was impossible. How do you coordinate feet, hands, eyes? And will that person next to you ever shut up? I don't know what I'm doing. Here comes somebody. You're screaming, and it's a disaster. Within a few months of doing that, it's so automatic that you're doing it with one hand, you're tuning the radio, you're smoking a cigarette, and you're holding a conversation on with somebody on the phone and somebody in the back seat at the same time while you're changing gears. How do you manage to do that? Because you've automated. Your system tends to automate with practice. Not everything gets automated, but lots of routine behaviors get automated. It has to free up space in your brain. So are we constructing our own worlds? And am I running out of time? I hope not. Well, to some extent, yes. You choose what you see based on the cues from the world, your experience, your framing of the world, your attention. And notice, people are after your attention all the time. They want your attention. Systems want your attention. Applications want your attention. Other companies want your attention. Okay? And of course, your mood comes in there as well. Whether you admit it or not, you process differently depending on your mood. You do naturally seek and respond to patterns. That's part of an automating response that you just make. But you process all this. And this is the crucial part of it when we think about information technology. You process information yourself within a constrained but flexible cognitive architecture. There are limits. We have studied these. We understand a lot about how people work, reason, use language, and the constraints that are operating on them for taking in masses of information. Now, why, given we know all that, would we not want to design better information technology systems that are built around the human and not against the human? I won't go into this in too much detail, but essentially this is, if I opened up your heads and took a schematic of what's inside in some very simple form, you have a memory, you have very limited attention resources, you're bombarded from the world, you have to perceive, that takes some attention. As you sit here in a room, there are lots of stimuli occurring which you're paying no attention to, but you will now that I mention it. Like, how hard is that seat? Okay? Do you notice the person next to you? Are you feeling comfortable in the clothes that you're wearing? Do you hear any background noise? All this is going on all the time, but hopefully you're sort of filtering it out most of the time, because you can filter out parts of the world. But things you don't filter out will grab your attention once they get to a certain threshold. Your attention is limited. Your memory, much more infinite. But in some simplistic way of representing your engagement with the world, that's what we think is happening in your head. Order can help. It can turn a mess of input into a structured experience which has you going, got it. Okay? That's a design process. It's represented very simplistically there, but that's the essence of information design and information architecture. Can we get some order, patterns, structure, and enabling devices around that information that will give you an intuitive grasp or an ability to intuit, because that takes effort to get there, faster than we currently do. Why does that matter? Well, Sudha May, who is a researcher at Microsoft, who I'm a big admirer of, and her argument is that the improvements you'll get through making a better interface design are 3 to 4 times better than those gained through a better search algorithm. Okay, 3 to 4 times. A lot of the effort that we put in the design, we're putting in the wrong places. We should be really putting it into understanding humans and how they think and reason and what they do. I don't know if that's a signal to me. It's not a signal. Okay. Good. So with usability, if we design for usability, you'll get greater predictability, you get learning. We'll learn about your automatic responses. We understand about the conditions for progress. And without that, if we don't design for this, you're going to just face the stress and disorientation that is your everyday existence at the moment. We're here to help. Okay, there is a path forward, and there is a progress you can make. But usability is not fixed. I want to tell you something else about yourself. You change over time in a predictable way that's not easy to design for. Here's just some quick data, and I don't want to go into the nuts and bolts of it, but it's a study I did of people performing tasks on 2 different database systems. They were the exact same tasks and the exact same content, but what we changed was the interface that you experienced when you played with it. And I call them the friendly and the unfriendly. And here's just a representation of the number of errors that people were making over trials. Each of these trials was a day. Okay, so this is just 10 days. Not a long time. It's actually a long time in usability studies because most people want to get everything done in 10 minutes. But we actually had people come back in and we repeated what they were doing. And we noticed, okay, look, we can design a system so that the first time they use it, they're actually making significantly less errors than if you design it badly. And actually, it's quite fun to design something badly. Many people do it easily. We had to work at it. But it's quite a lot of fun to actually design deliberately to make something just quite awful and difficult to use. But what happened, and we thought was curious, was that if you make people stick with something that's badly designed, humans, being capable, being talented, being intelligent, recognizing patterns, can learn to master it. Now, it helps if you bribe them to come back every day and pay them money to engage with it. But how many times have you experienced technologies that you've just wrestled with and eventually got used to mastering and become competent with? I would say an awful lot. Okay? An awful lot. There's a big push to figure out what do people do the first time they pick something up, and that's the design challenge. I actually think there's a bigger design challenge here, and there's something interesting watching here. What we noticed that by the time you get to day 5 or 6, certainly by the time 7, 8, the differences between the two systems, in terms of errors, were non-existent. So you might argue, well, then design doesn't matter. Just force people to use whatever you build, and if you can force them, they'll master it. And in fact, that's true. Please don't take that away, though. That is true. If you run the world and you force people, and if your last name is Microsoft, you can do that. But it's no coincidence I'm using a Mac. The story isn't over. In this one, we brought people back again. As if 10 days of agony wasn't enough for our poor, unfriendly folks. We actually made them come in and perform a stress trial and then do a transfer. And this was curious as well, because even though by day 8, 9, 10, they looked like they were performing pretty much like people in the well-designed system were performing, if you put them under stress, which in our case was to tell them that they were actually performing significantly slower than anybody else we'd ever seen, and could they pick it up? I mean, this was before IRB would have, you can't damage people that way. Actually, it's quite interesting. You put a clock in front of them and tell them to sort of go faster. And the people in the less well-designed system, they all deteriorated a little under those conditions, as you can imagine. But those in the badly designed system got significantly worse. And what does that tell us? Well, it told us that, okay, they might look like they're performing quite well, but under stress, and under stress we know processing changes, your short-term memory ability gets lessened, your decision-making capability doesn't feel as comfortable to you, okay? You forget things, the performance deteriorated. In the 12th trial, and the graph coloring doesn't show it terribly, what we actually did there was take people who'd learned, and this is really fascinating, learned on the bad system, and we made them use the good system, the system that we knew was better. And in fact, they got worse. They got worse. So when people tell you, well, I've always used Windows, I just can't get used to Mac, I say, yeah, that's because that's you. Okay? You've mastered something really bad, and you've become stuck with it. Stick with the good system, and I'm not getting a fee for this. Stick with a good system, and you'll actually be better off. No, but the beauty there is you can learn to master something to the point that you're competent on it, that a change in it, even a change that we think we can document as better, by objective measures, may not be better for you. Okay? Because of the flexibility in your own cognitive architecture. So it is sort of fascinating. Totally take that into abstract terms. When we, species, first discovered X-rays, if you show an X-ray to somebody who's never seen one before, I guess there's bones in there somewhere, okay? But an expert who's learned to read X-rays can actually look at that and say, oh, that's significant. We need to pay attention to that. How did somebody get that good? Practice, effort, interpretation. We are at the early stage of the X-ray when it comes to information technology. We still don't know what makes something really good, what really works. We know what books can do. We're pretty lousy at what a digital version of anything can do. Okay, so we're at the early stages. Now, we will get better. We will be able to understand these phenomena, and we will be able to design systems rather like the medical industry, the medical practitioners can now look at images that we thought of were indiscriminate and sort of blurry and actually have a refined perception. That takes effort, it takes knowledge, it takes practice, it takes science. It takes design, it takes data. And we're getting there. But we are still at a very, very early stage. I don't really have much more to say because I do want to leave time for questions. But I will say that the emphasis on data is only one part of what we should be worried about. We really have to worry about humans. We have to worry about how they explore data and how they interpret data, because they do it rulefully. Okay? They do it in a way that's bounded by some principles, and we just have to get better at understanding those principles. So when you're swimming in a world of data and people are telling you to keep up, I say, you know, well, I'm going to go over this because there's some actual studies I don't think I've got time to go into. We need to exploit the power of design a lot better, and we're not so good at it right now. We should not treat data as the same as information and knowledge. I love the fact that we've got big data. The real quest is for big knowledge. And that won't come from having more data, per se. It comes from a better understanding of how humans respond, use, and take advantage of the data sets that are out there. I don't think truth is paragraph-based. I don't think tweets are going to ever give us the literature that we might hope that they're going to give us. I guess a guy who can tweet about Oreos in the Super Bowl darkness can make themselves famous for a while and get a pay rise as a result. But in the longevity of life, this is not Shakespeare. Okay? Narrative forms which are long and involved and difficult to read have a purpose. And the immersion of yourself in deep information and deep knowledge is the truly rewarding human experience, and we're only, if you like, skirting the top level at the moment with information technology. But we must learn the difference between data and information and knowledge. So let me give you some practical things that you can do. Because Gail says to me, you know, tell them what to do. Give them some things they can walk away with. Okay, limit distractions. It's the simplest, most basic advice I can give anybody. Okay? Don't feel compulsed at every minute to check your email. Okay, this is not making you a better human being, and it's certainly not making you more productive. Okay? Understand what you need to know in the globality of your activities. Can I use that expression? The globality of your activities? I just did. It works. In your life, okay? Understand the limits on your own attention and memory. They're not to be worried unduly about. We all have them. It's the way we're wired. Celebrate it. Design for it. Design your own interactions for it on an understanding that you can't overcome them terribly easily. Check your own understandings. Don't blame yourself for bad designs. There's a lot of bad design out there, okay? If you don't like something, get rid of it. Complain. You know, don't think you have to warp your own cognitive architecture all the time to fit with some poor designs that are out there. But the worst, most seductive ones are those that have you checking for constant updates. That's wheeling itself into your life constantly. It's not helping you actually think deeper or think more richly. So I go back to the point I made at the start. Understand in your own existence, in your own job, in your own work, in your own leisure time, the difference between an information need and an information want. Choose the technologies appropriately for the needs, and there's an escalating and amplifying effect that comes from that, which is the real power of this data and this information. The trouble is a lot of technology, because it knows that you are wired to react to movement and to react to change, is attention captive, and not in ways that are necessarily meaningful for your task. There are situations where that's perfect, okay? There are situations where you can choose it and it can be fun. The danger is you don't learn to discriminate between that and the real task at hand in your work. Okay, that's the message I think I want to leave you. Big data is here. We have a long way to go before we get to big information and big knowledge. Thank you.